Okay, this week we are talking about a very hard topic. Last week was hard. This week's not much easier. It's the topic of heaven and hell. So, really, the idea is we want to look at what the Bible says about these things. Um, and for heaven, I want to touch on this question. Does the reality of heaven, as given in the Bible, speak into our fears and our suffering? And then for hell, this is a harder question: is how does this mesh with God's goodness? Like, how can God both be good and loving, and people go to hell? So, just so you know, what we're going to do when I'm talking, I'm going to give you a an overview of like six main points about heaven. One is that God's presence is central, restoration of God's presence. Two, there will be no evil or suffering or anything like that. Um, and then, therefore, there'll be a time of rest. But those are common ones. The next four, I feel like maybe are more new. Four is that we will live an embodied new life, so a resurrected body in a physical place as opposed to kind of this ethereal cloud thing that we often talk about in culture, and that our lives will not just be a heavenly worship service where we're just singing, but we will have lives that we live um, in the new creation. So that's heaven. And then hell, there's much less biblical information. Um, Basically, the idea is that this eternal separation and that it's not pleasant, right? And you got in Revelation talks about eternal torment and the lakes of fire. Also in Mark, Jesus talks about this as well. Um, and so that's the basic information. I'm going to touch briefly on, uh, what is the order of events. I'm not going to get really into it. I'm just going to try to make people aware that there's some debate about, what happens in between. Um, when you die and when Christ returns, and also, touch briefly on like the idea that there's a millennial age and people debate that. There was also questions about tribulation. I'm not going to go really into it, and I would encourage you not to get too wrapped up in that, unless your people are just like dying to talk about it. But and then also I'm going to talk a little bit about universalism and the idea that of eternal hell versus people being what's called annihilationism, where people say that hell is not an eternal experience, but that the second death in Revelation is actually just kind of like an end of existence, which feels more merciful to people. And all this really, so our two questions that we're kind of talking about: does the heavenly reality speak into our fear and suffering? Now, this has to do so in your Bible study. Let me say this before I get into the Bible study. I'm going to get everybody a worksheet with some of my key points, so that everybody has the references and can use them and look at them. Hopefully, that will help. Um, but if you look at the Bible study in 1 Corinthians 15, I'm having you read again. Last week you read a little bit about the idea that there's a resurrection. I'm having you look at that chapter again. Let me talk through this real quick, because in 1 Corinthians 15 it talks about how we have one kind of body now and another kind of body later. And I think there's a temptation sometimes to read it through our lens of how we usually think about heaven, to think, oh, like now I have this physical body, but later I'm going to have this like ghostly body, or like I'm an angel or something like that. But what it's saying is that the change in our bodies is we're going to be glorified like the risen Christ. We don't know all of what that means, but we're going to have a glorified physical body, and that the big change is that it's not going to be prone to decay or death like our current body is. And really, this comes down to the big so what. So, like when we talk about heaven, and I think the felt question is, at least when I was younger, it was like, is heaven something that gives me hope? You know, aside from just like not being dead, like is there an active hope there? And in verse 58, Paul says something really interesting in 1 Corinthians 15. He basically says, therefore, because all these things are true, don't give up in doing good, you know? And the question is, why does he say that? Why does the resurrection, you might think he would say, like, this is coming, so hang on so you make it, right? But that's not what he says. He says, don't give up, so that I want to pull it up. It's not working. Here we go. I'm going to read it. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. In other words, God is redeeming and is going to redeem and restore all things. So when we sow seeds for the kingdom, these aren't things that are just going to get thrown away. We are building for an embodied eternity. Okay. And so our lives matter now. This isn't just a proving ground to see if we can make it. Jesus teaches us to pray, let your kingdom come, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so there's a different kind of hope there. So when you read 1 Corinthians, that's really my aim. But then I'm going to have you look at Matthew 25 and Revelation 20 and 21. And there is a lot going on here. You're going to see a lot of stuff about judgment, a lot, especially the first part. And then the second half, Revelation 21, is more to do with the new creation. But one thing I want to point out in this video, I have a question: how is a judgment decided? And it talks a lot about how, like, okay, God's going to look at what you've done, look at your life, and you're going to answer for that. And this brings up two questions for us. One is, why do you think a judgment is necessary for a good and righteous God? So let me pause there for just a minute, because I'm going to talk about this in my talk. One of them, there's a few arguments that you can make. One is the argument of choice. So we're all kind of choosing our path, that love necessitates choice. And so there's a C.S. Lewis quote I'm going to have you guys wrestle with, but this idea that, like, he says kind of like, all who are in hell choose it. And so that's a biblical idea, but also an argument that's kind of like, well, this isn't God's fault. In fact, God is trying to rescue, but we'll get there in a second. The other argument that we need to talk about is that justice and goodness can't be separated. So if God is not just, he's not good, is essentially the weight of the argument. And since sin is not just a arbitrary thing, it's actually like a relational affront. We are sinning against not just a code, but a person, an infinitely holy person. And so our crime sentence has eternal implications, is kind of how you can think about it. So that's two arguments. The third one is that holiness also means goodness. So if God is holy, in other words, he's set apart, not just in splendor, but in goodness. And if heaven is the place where God dwells and where God's will is done, sin cannot be there, because it's an affront to many things, but one of them is goodness. And if we want an eternal holiness, an eternal goodness, sin cannot be there. People who are unwilling to surrender to God's ways, which is the way of goodness. And then finally, I think the strongest argument is that God's posture is mercy. Okay, God does not want anyone to go to hell. That's not it's not his design or his intention. And I think that this may seem like such a simple argument, but I really think it's the strongest, that God is going to such great lengths to rescue shows me that he really does want us to be with him. And so, I don't know, wrestle with this with your group, but judgment, why is it necessary for a good and righteous God? If you want to talk about this more, let's do that. That's a big topic. I'll try to explain more as I'm talking on Thursday night. And then the other question, when we look at these judgment passages, is how does the idea of God judging us based on what we've done connect with salvation? And now this is where you're kind of need to talk about, like, what we do stems from who we are. And God is not just saying, like, do more good than bad. he's saying we're gonna, we know who we are by the fruit that we bear. Um, and so that's kind of where that one's going. I don't want people to get tripped up on that one. I do have a C.S. Lewis quote in here. I'll read it to you. There are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says in the end, "Thy will be done." All that are in hell choose it. Without that self choice, there could be no hell. No hell that seriously and constantly desires joy, or no soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find; those who knock, it is opened. I encourage you to wrestle with that. There's some things in there you might like. There's some things you might not like. Um, but I like this quote. It's provocative, and I think that it gets us thinking about how God is thinking about us and the reality of turning away from Him in rebellion. And then at the end of the day, what I kind of have you focusing on in prayer time, you could really, I mean, sure, I think it's okay to intellectually engage this topic, and I hope you do. Um, but I also want to say that if we just intellectually engage the topic and we don't engage it with our hearts, we're going to miss the point. Um, and this is why kind of one of the reasons I like this Lewis quote is he forces you to ask, are you saying thy will be done? Or is God going to say to you, thy will be done? And so, this idea of hell, I think there's a fear that's appropriate, but I also think that it's God's mercy that draws us in. And when we see the weight of where sin is headed, I think it should cause us to pause and consider, what is your identity? What is your life about? I think that's the thrust of the whole thing for people. So that's all I have. I realize it's a little long. It's a big topic. Please, let's chat if you want to chat. I got a lot of thoughts bouncing around, so happy to talk. See you soon.